except for the last paragraph. And the last paragraph, there were two versions. One ended up tragically with Jack sexually assaulting Barbara, and the other ended up upbeat, where Jack proposed to marry Barbara and she agreed. So two radically different outcomes. And each subject got one of the two. And then they were asked, after reading the last paragraph, whether that was honest from the entire story leading up. And both groups said it was predictable. So everybody in the study rated the conclusion predictable, regardless of which outcome they got. And when they were asked why it was predictable, once they knew the answer, they pulled up things from the story that would support that conclusion. But the story was written, so there were, it was a relationship, there were goods and bads throughout. And so, but people emphasized only those that supported what they eventually knew happened. And then claimed, yeah, it was obvious. They would have predicted that this relationship was doomed, or this relationship was going to end in marriage. So participants claim they could have predicted the ending, even though the stories were identical, except for the ending. And not only did people, when asked to justify it, pull out and emphasize the parts that were consistent with the eventual ending. This goes back a number of lectures into memory, but they actually misremembered things. They added stuff in that were consistent with the eventual outcome. Kind of was a false memory. If we think about the real world, so that's an experimental case that shows pretty good evidence of this, but it also shows up in the real world. So I will rarely defend George W. Bush, but I will on this issue, which is, long after September 11th, 2001 happened, 9/11 happened, during the investigations, it came out that there had been a daily security briefing in which one of the items was an item that said Bin Laden, wants to attack on U.S. soil, and in that description, it mentioned that they were thinking about using airplanes to try to attack populations. Now, when people found that briefing, people went nuts and started being like, oh, the Bush administration totally dropped the ball, and started blaming them for kind of negligence of not following up on that briefing. But that's like, I will defend Bush in this case, which is, that's hindsight bias. Now that we know that of all the briefings he got, right, every day there's, not anymore, but Bush was president, every day there was a presidential security briefing. And each day there are many items in it. So this is like one thing of thousands that came up during his administration. And yeah, now that you know the outcome, you're like, oh, you should have known. It was obvious. There was a briefing. But at the time, it was just one of thousands of unlikely events, and you have to make decisions about which things you're going to pursue. And it's like people attacking him on that is a classic case of hindsight bias. Sure, once you know how it comes out, obviously he should have paid more attention to that one. But at the time that it happened, that didn't seem like a legitimate urgent threat. And this happens in all sorts of cases, where once you know the outcome, people are like, oh, of course we shouldn't have done that. But they then selectively pick out information that suggests, oh, sure, you should have known. But at the time that information happened, before you knew the outcome, that information wasn't as telling as it later appears to be. Hindsight bias. And I think if you think about it, you can come up with all sorts of cases where hindsight bias plays a big role in how people reevaluate what's there. Okay. Another aspect of decision making that is bizarre is that you can actually, because people rely on memory for evaluating kind of choices, and memory is not totally veridical, you can actually get people to choose a bad alternative based on how memory works. So, choosing more of something. So, again, Kahneman, in this case, left Friesman for Tversky Adams. But he did an experiment in which he brought people into the lab and he gave them a really not very pleasant experience, which is a cold water conference. So, for a long time we couldn't shock people in psychology, but people still wanted aversive stimuli, and so they went over to cold water baths as kind of their aversive stimuli. We happen to know people are shocking one over again. The cold water method kind of took the place of electric shock for a number of days. But people would show up in the lab, and what would happen is you'd be asked to immerse your hand in a vat of 14 degrees Celsius water for 60 seconds. That is painfully cold water. Painfully cold. And that was one condition. And then they allowed you to warm up. And then you had another condition where you had to immerse your hand, again for 60 seconds, in 14 degrees Celsius water. Again, painful hand situation. And then you had an additional 30 seconds in 15 degrees Celsius water, which is still painful, but not as painful as 14-degree water. And actually, once you're in 14-degree water, feels noticeably less painful. But if you just look at the math, okay, so then they ask you, hey, you're almost done, but we have to do one of those two conditions. But you get to choose. Now, if they laid it out like this, if they told you what they had done, you should say, well, I'm doing number one. I'm out of here 30 seconds sooner, and this has more overall pain. I get the same of pain that I get in this one, plus an additional 30 seconds of not so bad pain. So the rational thing to do is choose one. Almost nobody chooses one. Now they aren't given all the math, they're just given the experience. Right? But a vast majority of people choose option 2 when they get to choose what to do with it. And that's weird. So almost 70% pick the longer version. Which suggests that when kind of evaluating how good or bad something is, you don't kind of have a really rational kind of, well, that one was longer, it's all painful. You basically go from memory. And it turns out that in memory, the most recent part of an event is the most salient. And so the fact that the end of that option 2 was not as bad makes you rate option 2 is not that bad. You overemphasize that end portion. And so you can get people to choose more of a bad thing, essentially, by how you structure it. You want to leave it good at the end, and then rate the whole experience as being more positive. I really want to use my surge. But I didn't, so it's still not that hard. But this is a lab-based experiment of it. They have actually implemented this in real-world scenarios. The real-world scenarios are a little unpleasant, but they've actually implemented this and did a study on colonoscopy. And it turns out that one problem with colonoscopy is getting people to go, especially if there's somebody like at risk for something like prostate cancer. They often miss their second and third meetings, second and third exams. And so there was interest in, could you apply something like this and get people to rate the overall experience more positively, even though you're doing the same test? And the same group ran in a medical setting a version of this cold water press, but with colonoscopy, where basically the exam was a colonoscopy exam for everybody, but one group had like typical treatment as usual, and the other group had a really extended period of time during the uninsertion of the colonoscopy. So it took longer, but it wasn't quite as painful at the end. And they actually showed that those patients who had that longer, less unpleasant at the end procedure were more likely to show up for their second. Which begs the question, do we know why we make the decisions we make? So in these heuristics, we can demonstrate kind of what types of processes people are using. We can at least describe it. And we can describe the biases. And yet, that suggests, like if you ask people, why did you do that? People are rarely like, oh, I use the availability heuristic, or I use the representative heuristic. But more generally, the question becomes, do people actually know why they make the decisions they make? Why they make the judgments? And the common sense answer is like, yes, we're rational beings. You come to decisions out of some decent, if not perfect, thought process. But there are a group of people who have suggested that maybe that's not the case. And kind of the two researchers who have really been pushing this are Nisbet and Wilson, who have been pushing this for decades. And they claim no, that by and large, people just behave. And they don't do a whole lot of rational thought when they're making decisions. That people have little or no access to the processes underlying their decisions, choices, and preferences. Decisions or judgments. But if you ask them, why did they do what they did, or decide what they did, or why do they do that judgment? You're asking them to introspect, say, what was the process? Why did you come up with this decision? And it's only at that point that they even bother to think about it. And at that point, they will retrieve or make up things that make it seem like it was a rational decision. They'll give you a reason. That might not have been the reason that actually drove them to do the decision. But when you ask, why did you decide that? Then they're like, and they'll make something up to make themselves sound rational and not like this crazy person. That was their theory. And they have a bunch of weird studies to provide evidence of this. But the basic evidence of Nisbet and Wilson, all of it kind of follows the same flavor, which is they have subjects make some choice. They did a lot of preference. But they have people make some choice. They manipulate some variable between subjects. And they can show that the manipulation of that variable changes people's choices. And they document that the variable they manipulated changes people's preferences. And then they ask people, why did they make that choice? Why was that their preference? And they usually ask them